In 1917, a Canadian soldier was asleep in a dugout near Vimy Ridge when his brother shook him awake. He followed him out into the night. Minutes later, the dugout was destroyed by shell fire. There was just one problem. His brother had been reported missing in action over a year before. Hi, I'm Harriet, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at ghost stories connected to the First World War, from first-hand memoirs to later battlefield folklore. Some of these accounts come from named soldiers writing in their own words, like Will Bird at Vimy Ridge, while others involved repeated sightings in the same place, such as trench reports near Givenchy. We're also going to be looking at the haunted submarine UB-65, the aircrew story known as the Dead Hand at the Controls, and of course the Angel of Mons, the most famous story out of the First World War. These are the stories and what we actually know about them, so let's get into it. Will Bird was serving with the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the spring of 1917, during the fighting around Vimy Ridge in northern France. Years later, he wrote about one extraordinary night he never forgot. He'd been asleep in a dugout cut into the chalk, taking advantage of a brief lull in the shelling, when someone shook him awake. When he opened his eyes, there was a figure standing next to him, close enough to be unmistakable. He recognised him immediately, even before his mind caught up. The figure didn't speak. He turned and moved out of the dugout, and Will followed, climbing up into the trench and then along it without being told where to go. Something felt wrong in a quiet, chilling way, but he couldn't work out what it was. They'd only gone a short distance when the ground suddenly shook. Behind him, the dugout he'd been sleeping in was hit by shell fire and collapsed completely. Will was unhurt. He later wrote that his brother Stephen had been killed tragically in action the previous year. He was serving with the 25th Battalion when he died on the 12th of October 1915 near Locre in Belgium, following the explosion of an enemy mine. In 1930, Will published his memoir of his wartime experience titled And We Go On, later reprinted as Ghosts Have Warm Hands. Now, the book is not a collection of ghost stories. It's a straightforward account of his service on the Western Front, covering the Somme, Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele. The incident appears as part of that wider narrative, without speculation or explanation. His account has remained consistent across editions of the book and in later references. He never altered the details and never attempted to explain what he believed had happened. He simply recorded the event as he experienced it. Now, I think the next account of ghost sightings in the First World War is chilling because it wasn't a single sighting. It was repeated by multiple soldiers over time, all describing the same thing. During 1915 and 1916, Canadian units spent extended periods holding trenches near the village of Givenchy. The position was repeatedly shelled, repaired, and reoccupied, often with little change in the overall line. Men from the Canadian 15th Battalion later reported a recurring sight along one section of the trench, close to an area where the parapet had partially collapsed. Sentries on night duty claimed to see a lone figure walking along the duckboards late at night. The figure was described as tall and upright, moving at a steady pace, as if on patrol. When challenged, it didn't respond. When the sentry moved forward to investigate, the figure would disappear before reaching the damaged section of the trench. These reports didn't come from one person. Versions of the story were told by different men at different times, often without knowledge of each other's experiences. While minor details varied, the central description remained consistent. No official explanation was recorded. The trench in question had seen heavy casualties earlier in the fighting and was known to be unstable and difficult to hold. The Givenchy sightings are frequently included in collections of Canadian First World War ghost reports because they involve multiple witnesses, a clearly identified unit and location, and a description that remained broadly consistent as it was passed on. By the early 1930s, the idea of Vimy Ridge as haunted ground had entered public memory. In 1931, the artist Will Longstaff painted Ghosts of Vimy Ridge, showing fallen Canadian soldiers rising and moving across the battlefield. Painting was not based on a reported sighting, but it reflects how quickly the language of ghosts became associated with the place. The extraordinary success and sacrifice of Vimy Ridge later took on a special place in Canadian memory, taught in schools as a defining battle, much like Gallipoli in Australia. This places the Phantom Sentry firmly in the category of post-war memory, rather than a sighting recorded at the time. Not all First World War ghost stories come from the trenches. Some come from places even more confined. The German submarine UB-65 developed a reputation among its crews long before it ever entered combat. During construction and early sea trials in 1917, a series of fatal accidents occurred. Men were killed on board before the boat had even been fully commissioned, and among the crews assigned to it, the submarine quickly gained a reputation as cursed. Submarine service was among the most psychologically demanding roles of the war. Crews lived sealed inside narrow steel compartments, sleeping inches from engines and torpedo tubes, surrounded by the constant smell of oil, sweat, and stagnant air. Once submerged, there was no escape. Every unfamiliar sound mattered. In later retellings, sailors claimed that after the death of a senior officer during early trials, his figure was seen on deck during night watches. He was described as standing silently near the bow, arms folded, staring out at the water. One crewman, identified in later accounts as a lookout named Peterson, reportedly deserted after claiming he'd seen the dead officer walk up the gangplank and take his place on the deck as if nothing had happened. The submarine's commanding officer, Martin Schell, was later said to have witnessed the figure himself during a rough patrol in the English Channel, along with the watch officer on duty. These officers don't appear in surviving German naval logs. They surface later in post-war naval folklore and British accounts of U-boat operations. UB-65 was lost in July 1918, destroyed by an unexplained explosion off the coast of Ireland. And now on to one of my favourite ghost stories. This one centres on a named individual in a specific place. Lieutenant Desmond Arthur was a pilot with the Royal Flying Corps. In 1913, he was killed when his aircraft crashed near Montrose Airfield in Scotland. Official inquiry blamed Arthur, claiming that he'd been flying recklessly. During the war, as Montrose became a major training base for new pilots, reports began to circulate of a figure seen in flying kit moving through the officers' mess and sleeping quarters. Multiple officers claimed to have seen him. Pilots sleeping in one particular room also reported feeling watched or disturbed during the night. The editor of the Aeroplane magazine, C.G. Gray, took a personal interest in the case. He believed Arthur had been wrongly blamed for the crash and suggested the sightings reflected an unresolved injustice. In 1916, a second inquiry was held. This time, investigators found a structural defect in the aircraft's wing, and Arthur was formally exonerated. According to those at Montrose, the sightings stopped soon after. This is a case I might do a more in-depth episode on in the future because I do find it fascinating. Our next story had circulated among airmen and passed from squadron to squadron as a cautionary tale. This account appears in Lord Halifax's Ghost Book, published several years after the war. It was related to Halifax by a pilot identified only as Captain Villiers, who claimed he'd heard it while serving in France. According to the story, 4 young pilots spent an evening gambling together. One of them, the youngest, lost heavily. Unable to pay, he wrote out a series of IOUs and promised to settle his debts the following day. The next morning, he took off and was killed almost immediately in a crash. The second pilot then flew in a 2-seat aircraft. Despite being alone, he also crashed. Before dying, he reportedly claimed the dead pilot had been sitting in the empty seat behind him and had forced the controls forward. The third pilot was killed outright in a similar accident. The fourth, terrified, begged not to fly. He was ordered up regardless. He crashed as well, surviving just long enough to claim that unseen hands had wrenched the control column from his grip. And now on to our last story. This is the most famous ghost story of the First World War. In late August 1914, during the British retreat from Mons, stories began circulating at home of something extraordinary appearing on the battlefield. Some accounts spoke of angels standing between British troops and the advancing German army. Others described shining figures moving through the smoke, or cavalry on white horses appearing at the moment the line was about to break. Earlier that same month, the writer Arthur Machen had published a short piece of fiction titled The Bowmen. It imagined ghostly medieval archers appearing to protect British soldiers. Machen made it clear that this story had been totally fictional, but it didn't remain that way for long. It was reprinted, retold, and altered. Within weeks, archers became angels. Angels became mounted figures. Some versions claimed German horses had refused to advance. Others insisted captured German soldiers had asked about the white-clad troops they'd seen fighting alongside the British. Writers such as Harold Begbie helped spread and reshape these accounts, presenting them as evidence of divine intervention rather than fiction or rumour. But no contemporary British soldier diary describes seeing angels at Mons. No official report mentions anything unusual. Machen himself repeatedly denied his story was based on fact. What can be traced very clearly is how quickly the legend evolved. I've included a link in the description to this story in case you're interested in reading it. The Angel of Mons wasn't recorded at the front. It was created in newspapers, sermons, and conversations at home. These aren't the only ghost stories from the First World War. There are other reported sightings, including those later associated with Verdun, but that's something I might come back to in another episode. Thanks for watching. There are other First World War ghost stories apart from these you've heard. Let me know in the comments. I'd love to read them. And if you've enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe, or consider becoming a channel member. I'll see you next time.